Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Ted, your host. And for today's lecture, we're going to discuss Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. But before we get to that, I'd like to just do a quick recap uh, to sort of bring everybody up to speed on the events leading up to Columbus's voyage. And now, the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, is done with. Leon Castile and Aragon, those their forces have taken Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella have finally expelled the last of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. Western Europe is has as a result of the Crusades, they've grown to love the exotic trade items that the Crusader states were able to give to them. They have a burgeoning trade, a burgeoning Mediterranean trade with the eastern terminus of the ancient Silk Road. Uh, the Turks serve as the inheritors, as the heirs of the both the Christian Crusader states and then also the Arab states that fought each other for control of the Eastern Mediterranean for the Holy Lands. The Turks come in, conquer all the Holy Lands, and eventually take a good deal, a major chunk of Europe itself. Basically all of Southeast Europe becomes Turkish, becomes a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans themselves are not Arabs. They're Central Asians. They embrace Islam, but they don't really hold the whole "we'll trade with anybody" thing that the Arabs had close to their heart. They're more than willing to trade, but they're only willing to trade under circumstances that they feel comfortable with, and they one block a lot of Christian traders from even coming in, and two, they charge exorbitant amounts for the trade goods. The Christian traders themselves are frustrated and angry, and they're looking for a way to circumvent the Ottoman blocking of the eastern end of the terminus to them. It doesn't matter to the Ottomans whether those goods get sold or not, but they do really care over who they traded over, who has access to these ports, and they do play hardball with the Christian traders. And that leads us to Columbus's voyage himself. Columbus's voyage was not meant to be a voyage of discovery. He had no intention, nor did he ever believe in his lifetime that he would discover new lands. The entire point of his expedition was to sail westward around what he thought would be a small open body of water to the to the shores of the east. He was sailing west to get to China and India. Okay, and that was all to circumvent the Turks in the east. If the Turks won't trade with that, then we'll simply cut the Turks out. We'll simply go east and get as much goods as we could, and pretty much break the land routes, the land trade routes. So now Columbus's voyage itself, one of the most, if not the most, monumental event in world history. It changed the world in every way, economically, politically, socially, ideologically, transformed the world. Europe leapt from being a regional backwater into a global titan. The consequences for Castile and Leon were even more immediate and even more grand. They leap from being a burgeoning power into a massive empire straddling both sides of the Atlantic. They are ridiculously wealthy. The native peoples themselves are decimated, enslaved, and suffer tragic pandemics, a major decline in their populations, the loss of all their territories, and the collapse of native states. The Lucayans, the people who Columbus meet, uh, they're wiped out completely in less than a generation. The native peoples, the Native Americans, have little to no resistance to diseases such as smallpox and measles, even the flu. Um, the Incans and the Aztecs. Their empires crumbles, not really overnight, but they crumble, and they never really rebound from the shock of the invasion and disease. And now Columbus's journey itself, it was a very harrowing journey. It was a very audacious journey as well. It had only ever been attempted once before, that is, sailing west to get to the east. And that ended in complete disaster. Two brothers, Vandino and Ugolino, they attempted, and they were also Genoese like Columbus. They attempted to sail west, and they were never heard from again. This happened about 240 something years before Columbus, but they attempted it, and they were never heard from again. So there was a lot of fear about sailing west and just never ever returning. And the voyage itself consisted of three ships: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, which was Columbus's flagship. And the voice, I had to say it earlier, it doesn't go well. Columbus grossly underestimated the size of the earth. His supplies ran low, and the expedition was in jeopardy of failing. The men were sick. They were scared. They wanted to go home. On the night before they were to return home, land was sighted by Rodrigo Triana, the lookout of the Pinta. And now that night, or should I say that day, there had been a meeting called between Columbus, the other captains of the two other ships, and basically all the surviving men. And they had all had enough. They wanted to go home. They did not want to die out on the sea. These were not men who Columbus had hired. These men, most of the men were in the service of the King of Spain. Well, not really the King of Spain, but the King of Aragon, Ferdinand II, and there was a small contingent from a merchant group that was backing the expedition, that had granted two ships to the expedition and was financially backing it. They had enough. They called Columbus out on keeping two different set of charts. Columbus, already seeing in the future that if the expedition was successful, the King of Spain might simply take his maps from him and say that, well, since I have the maps, I don't really need you. Seeing that, Columbus kept two different charts, one for himself and one that he would voluntarily give up to the King of Spain. They call Columbus out. They demand to go home. Columbus is able to get them to continue to sail for one more day, and in the span of them sailing for the rest of that day, rest of that night, Rodrigo Triana spots land. And now, in this event, that event was just monumental. That was the moment that the world changed completely. That small fleet had managed to traverse the Atlantic and make contact with new peoples, the Lucayans. And the Lucayans themselves, they were a subgroup of the Arawaks. And other subgroups of the Arawaks would include the Saboni of Cuba, the Tainos of Hispaniola. The Hispaniola is simply the modern, the name where the modern day nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. And this group, they land in the Bahamas. They land on the island of Guanahani, which the crew later renamed San Salvador, which is Spanish for Holy Savior. And you'll begin to see that as soon as they land someplace, they go ahead and just give it a Spanish name. So they landed on Guanahani, renamed San Salvador. And the first impression of the Spaniards was not a glorious one. It's not that glorious scene of Columbus looking beautiful, looking really spiffy in his nice clothing with that beautiful banner that has the coat of arms of Ferdinand and Isabella, stabbing it into the sand, claiming it all for the King of Spain. That's not the scene. The scene that occurred, the moment that they spotted land and they clambered onto the shore, was of them desperately trying to obtain food and water. Remember, their supplies were running low, their ships were cramped. These men were not in any position. And then again, too, they didn't know what type of people they'd meet. If the natives had been warlike, they may have simply just killed them or taken them captive or something like that. But they found really peaceful people, and Columbus would later remark that with 20 or 50 or so good men, you can enslave them all and to bend them to your will. A very ominous thing to say for anybody, but it would later be put into to really gruesome effect later on. But the scene, but after that, after climbing onto the shore, begging for food and water, they begin to rest up and heal up, and simply bask in the fact that they've made contact. And Columbus would for the rest of his life believe that he had made contact, that he had made it to the east. He thought that he had hit islands off the coast of modern-day India. Most likely, he probably thought that he had found Japan from the Adventures of Marco Polo. Marco Polo makes note that there are many islands off the coast of Asia. So he probably thought that he had hit the island archipelago of Japan, the group of islands, and that he was close to China. And that's why he gave the name to the local people as Indians. He called them Indios, Indians, and that's where that entire misnomer for Native Americans comes from. And now, after Columbus and his crew had regained their senses, he began to notice small bands of gold in the people's noses and on their wrists, and he began to ask them where they got it. Where was the source of this gold? Was it near? Was it far? And the Lucayans told him that it was not locally found, but could be obtained further south. And after taking on more supplies, he set out to find the source, taking local guides with him. And he landed on what is now known as Hispaniola, or as the Spanish called it, the Spanish island. And they established a post, La Navidad, named for Christmas, because supposedly the settlement was established on Christmas Day. And the reason that they were able to establish La Navidad was that one of his ships became unseaworthy. It was taking on water. They couldn't really repair it, so they decided to scrap it and use the material from the ship to create the settlement of La Navidad. And after founding La Navidad, Columbus left a portion of his crew there and sailed back to report his findings. And this begins the era of colonization. And now, upon his return, he was congratulated and sent at the head of a more well-funded and more well-supplied expedition. Ferdinand II, all you had to do was tell him gold. All he had to hear was the people that he sent on the expedition to report back to him that there was gold there for him to want the gold. Isabella, it appears, truly cared about Christians, and she truly cared about the natives, and she simply wanted the conversion of the natives, and that would sort of be a blessing and a curse for them. But Columbus, his new expedition, consisted of 17 ships and 1,200 men, and a lot of the men were noblemen. And upon his return to Hispaniola, he discovered that La Navidad had been destroyed. The men he left behind, they began to brutalize the local people, making demands on them, attacking the women. The locals became fed up, and they simply attacked and destroyed the settlement. And Columbus, who I noted earlier had reported that it would be easy to subjugate the local people, began to become increasingly more demanding on his host. He began to demand labor and increase gold production from them. And as he kept making harsher and harsher demands on the native peoples, he was also increasingly frustrated by his lack of navigational success. It began to dawn on a lot of people that Columbus had not reached the Indies, that he had not made it to India or China or islands off the coast of India or China, but rather he had made contact with two completely unknown continents. Columbus himself he would never even continent that idea. He remained convinced that he had landed off the coast of India and that he had met Indians from India. But try as he might, he found no gold and he found no major land masses that fit the description of India or China. Also, because more and more people were setting out now, the king of Aragon, Ferdinand II, no longer really needed Columbus. Remember, Columbus he had made two different charts. One to keep for himself so that he would always have employment, and then one to give to the King of Spain with all the bad plotting, the bad marks. Well, more and more people came out, and more people charted how to get to the Indies, making Columbus simply obsolete. The King of Spain, the King Ferdinand II, very quickly relieved Columbus of his duties as the principal navigator for the Spanish crown. Columbus would make 4 journeys, 4 voyages, and after that, he would die, pretty much a broken man. He would be hauled, as a matter of fact, he would once be hauled back to Spain in irons, in chains, for violating the commands of the Spanish crown, of the orders of Ferdinand and Isabella. And the immediate breaking of Columbus's monopoly, his information monopoly, Ferdinand began to employ other captains, and they in turn began to serve his cause, and it pretty much opened the floodgates to later conquistadors and explorers. Once contact had been made, and once the goods, the raw materials from the Americas began to flow back into Europe, Leon, Castile, and Aragon, they began to grow rich very, very quickly, basically exploiting the native peoples for as much as they could. They embarked on a series of just stunning martial conquests, aided limitedly by gunpowder and largely by disease, the horse, and war dogs. And the Arawaks, they were stunned and terrified by the presence of the dog, which is not native to the Antilles. And the horse itself, it's just simply as terrifying a stunning animal, but the horse allowed for rapid movement of troops who conducted fast, devastating attacks on Arawak communities. And Ferdinand and Isabella were quickly able to establish their empire and sought to keep all other European powers out, but could not keep Portugal out of the empires of the Americas. Portugal, which had been Columbus's first choice in pitching his idea of transoceanic voyaging, the Portuguese were interested in exploiting the economic situation just as the Spanish monarchs were, and gaining control over trade routes to the east. The Portuguese at that point were the most expert European navigators. They had long sailed along the western coast of Africa and were plotting new points, trying to round the tip of South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, or as they called it, Bona Esperanza. They thought they were close when Columbus made his pitch to the Portuguese king, and they attempted to play both sides of the field by continuing their expeditions along the African coast and keeping Columbus at court. Now, the reason they did this was that they already had a monopoly on the Portuguese navigators and so forth. All of them had been trained at a navigation school headed by a Portuguese dynast, Prince Henry, who earned the title Henry, or should I say rather, was given the title the Navigator, the designation of Navigator, even though he never once set foot on a ship. He was simply a patron of maritime activities. So the Portuguese already had a state-sponsored monopoly on ship captains. They didn't have to worry about people leaving Portugal and taking this knowledge to the Spaniards or even the French, for that matter. They did not, however, have the same advantage where Columbus was concerned. Columbus was not a Portuguese. He was not Portuguese. He was Genoese, and Just as surely as he could walk into Lisbon and pitch this idea to the King of Portugal, he could just as quickly walk or simply cross the border and go to Ferdinand and Isabella and pitch the same idea to them. So it behooved, it was in the best interest of the Portuguese king to keep Columbus at his court for as long as he could until he had a clear-cut answer on whether he could get to the east by sailing along the African coast. And so the Portuguese king, his little game began, and his game was simple: to continue funding his Portuguese sailors while keeping Columbus at his court. And every time Columbus's expedition, every time the day for his expedition was nearing, the Portuguese king will remember that he had promised the same amount of ships and the same amount of men to another explorer, to another ship's captain, pushing back Columbus's departure date even further, even further, even further. And after about a year of this, Columbus simply snuck out of Portugal, leaving a lot of creditors in Portugal, one, but also leaving the king of Portugal in the lurch. He made his way to Spain, made his pitch to Ferdinand and Isabella, and that's basically what we've covered in our lecture. But the Portuguese themselves, the moment the Spanish made that Columbus made contact, they began to piggyback on Ferdinand and Isabella's success. They couldn't be kept out. Portugal is closer. Basically, all of the Western Iberian, the Atlantic Western coastline of the Iberian Peninsula is Portuguese. It belongs to Portugal. The Portuguese had that natural advantage, and they simply began to send ships out on exploration, trying to either make contact with India or China, as Columbus was reporting, and they were also looking to exploit and gain some of that mineral wealth that Spain was gaining. That not really Spain, but Leon, Castile, and Aragon were gaining. And the Pope, who was a Spaniard himself, he had been born Rodrigo Borgia in Cataluna, and he had taken the papal name Alexander VI upon his ascension to the papal tiara. He, wanting to stave off a devastating Christian against Christian war, intervened to make peace amongst the Spanish powers, peace amongst the House of Aviz and the Traptamarans, who ruled Portugal and Leon, Castile, and Aragon, respectively. The Pope, he did not want Europe's two brightest stars, Portugal and Spain, to embroil themselves in a series of destructive wars. So he settled the matter by intervening and compelling both sides to accept papal adjudication. The resulting treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, divided the world outside of Europe between the two Iberian powers. This is why they speak Portuguese in Brazil, and why Brazil is in the easternmost quadrant of South America. Because what the Pope did, he took a compass that you may remember from geometry class. He took a compass, opened it up to its maximum extent, and using Rome at the compass point, simply drew a circle, and whatever was east of the circle would go to Portugal, and whatever was west of the circle would go to Spain. That's why Brazil is in that easternmost quadrant of South America. And this is also why only a small enclave in Africa speaks Spanish. During the rise of slavery, after the native peoples died out, the Spanish demanded a small enclave to meet their labor needs. So they were granted a small enclave in Africa, Equatorial Guinea, and all other European powers were excluded by this treaty, by the treaty that had papal or church blessing. All other European powers were excluded from partaking in the exploitation of the Americas, and and primarily this affects England and France, since those two powers were also pretty game for joining Spain and Portugal in exploiting the New World. And that pretty much concludes our lecture on Columbus's voyage. And now to summarize our lecture, to gear you up for what we're going to discuss in our next lecture, the Spanish powers are poised to be the most wealthiest and powerful states in the world. The other powers in Europe are frustrated, and they are looking for opportunity to cut into the Spanish powers' new prosperity. The civilizations of the Americas are collapsing, and the Columbian exchange, that is the exchange of goods and ideas from the Americas to Europe, and then also the exchange of goods and ideas from Europe to the Americas, is beginning now. It's about to hit the full extent. And just for to speak a little bit about the Columbian exchange, nothing really speaks of the Columbian exchange better than, I think, Hispanic food. Rice, for example, as we noted earlier in our lecture series, rice was introduced to Spain by the Arabs, but rice became a dominant feature in Spanish culture. And as we noted earlier, corn and beans figure predominantly in Native American diets, particularly in the Southwest, and they were both imported to the American Southwest from Mesoamerica, around modern day southern Mexico, Guatemala. Also, the tomato figured predominantly into their diets. When you add rice along with corn tortilla, or even beans, it's pretty predominant in their dietary needs. So the joining of rice and beans is what I'm getting at. Pretty much exemplifies what we mean by Columbian exchange, the exchange of foods, goods, ideas between Europe and the Americas. And I'm rambling at this point, but that's our lecture. I hope you enjoyed the lecture on Columbus. And as always, hit like, subscribe, tell somebody else, and comment on our lecture. And I'll see you guys next time for the next lecture.